Today I'm going to do some excerpt reading from Part 2 of State and Revolution, the experience of 1848 to 1851, specifically the eve of revolution. Lenin writes, quote, "We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class and to win the battle for democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Here we have a formulation of one of the most remarkable and most important ideas of Marxism on the subject of the state, namely the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, parentheses, as Marx and Engels began to call it after the Paris Commune, close parentheses. And also a highly interesting definition of the state, which is also one of the, quote, forgotten words of Marxism, quote, the state, i.e. the proletariat organized as the ruling class. This definition of the state has never been explained in the prevailing propaganda and agitation literature of the official social democratic parties. More than that, it has been deliberately ignored, for it is absolutely irreconcilable with reformism and is a slap in the face for the common opportunist prejudices and Philistine illusions about the, quote, peaceful development of democracy. The exploiting classes need political rule to maintain exploitation, i.e., in the selfish interest of the insignificant minority against the vast majority of the people. The exploited classes need political rule in order to completely abolish all exploitation, i.e., in the interest of the vast majority of the people against the insignificant minority consisting of modern slave owners, landowners, and capitalists." Lenin goes on to speak about the opportunists of the Second International. Quote, "This petty bourgeois utopia, which is inseparable from the idea of the state being above classes, led in practice to the betrayal of the interests of the working classes, as was shown, for example, by the history of the French revolutions of 1848 and 1871, and by the experience of, quote, socialist participation in bourgeois cabinets in Britain, France, Italy, and the other countries at the turn of the century." He goes on to write, "The overthrow of bourgeois rule can be accomplished only by the proletariat, the particular class whose economic conditions of existence prepare it for this task and provide it with the possibility and the power to perform it. While the bourgeoisie break up and disintegrate the peasantry and all the petty bourgeois groups, they weld together, unite, and organize the proletariat. Only the proletariat, by virtue of the economic role it plays in large-scale production, is capable of being the leader of all working and exploited people, whom the bourgeoisie exploit, oppress, and crush, often not less, but more than they do the proletarians, who are incapable of waging an independent struggle for their emancipation." Again, he rails on opportunism. Quote, "By contrast, the opportunism now prevailing trains the members of workers' parties to be representatives of the better paid worker, who lose touch with the masses, quote, get along fairly well under capitalism, and sell their birthright for a massive pottage, i.e., renounce their role as revolutionary leaders of the people against the bourgeoisie." After a few pages of history, he writes, "The extent to which Marx held strictly to the solid ground of the historical experience can be seen from the fact that, in 1852, he did not yet specifically raise the question of what was to take place of the state machine to be destroyed. Experience had not yet provided material for dealing with this question, which history placed on the agenda later on in 1871. In 1852, all that could be established with the accuracy of scientific observation was that the proletarian revolution had approached the task of, quote, concentrating all its forces of destruction against the state power, of smashing the state machine." Speaking on his views in 1852, he quotes Marx, "And now, as to myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of class struggle, and bourgeois economists the economic anatomy of the classes. What I did that was new was to prove, 1. The existence of classes is only bound up with the particular historical phases in development of production. 2. That the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And 3. That this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes into a classless society." Lenin writes, "In these words, Marx succeeded in expressing with striking clarity, first, the chief and radical difference between his theory and that of the foremost and most profound thinkers of the bourgeoisie, and secondly, the essence of his theory of the state. The theory of the class struggle was not created by Marx, but by the bourgeoisie before Marx, and generally speaking, it is acceptable to the bourgeoisie. Further, the essence of Marx's theory on the state, only by those who realize that the dictatorship of a single class is necessary not only for every class society in general, not only for the proletariat which has overthrown the bourgeoisie, but also for the entire historical period which separates capitalism from quote, classless society, from communism. Bourgeois states are most varied in form, but their essence is all the same. All these states, whatever their form, in the final analysis, are inevitably the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The transition from capitalism to communism is certainly bound to yield a tremendous abundance and variety of political forms, but the essence will inevitably be the same, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Next, he writes about Karl Marx's reaction to the first ever overthrow of bourgeois society, the Paris Commune, in 1871. It is well known that in the autumn of 1870, a few months before the Commune, Marx warned the Paris workers that any attempt to overthrow the government would be the folly of despair. But when, in March 1871, a decisive battle was forced upon the workers, and they accepted it, when the uprising had become a fact, Marx greeted the proletariat revolution with the greatest enthusiasm, in spite of the unfavorable arguments. Marx did not persist in the pedantic attitude of condemning a, quote, untimely movement. In fact, Lenin writes, the Paris Commune inspired Marx to update his thinking. Quote, the last preface to the new German edition of the Communist Manifesto, signed by both of its authors, is dated June 24, 1872. In this preface, the authors Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels say that the program of the Communist Manifesto has in some details become out of date, and goes on to say, quote, one thing especially was proved by the Commune, that the working class cannot simply lay hold of ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Instead, the proletariat must, quote, smash it. And this is the precondition for every real people's revolution on the continent. And this is what our heroic party comrades in Paris are attempting. The words, quote, to smash the bureaucratic military machine, end quote, briefly express the principal lesson of Marxism regarding the tax of the proletariat during the revolution in relation to the state. And this is the lesson that has not only been completely ignored, but positively distorted by the prevailing Kautskyite, quote, interpretation of Marxism, exclamation point. On what is to replace the bourgeois state machinery once the proletariat smashes it, Lenin writes, it is still necessary to suppress the bourgeoisie and crush their resistance. This was particularly necessary for the Commune, and one of the reasons for its defeat was that it did not do this with sufficient determination. The organ of suppression, however, here is the majority of the population, not a minority, as was always the case under slavery, serfdom, and wage slavery. And since the majority of the people itself suppresses its oppressors, a, quote, special force of suppression is no longer necessary. One piece of state machinery that must be smashed is the parliamentary system. Quote, to decide once every few years which members of the ruling class is to repress and crush the people through parliament, this is the real essence of bourgeois parliamentarism. Not only in parliamentary constitutional monarchies, but also in the most democratic republics. But abolishing the bureaucracy at once, everywhere, and completely is out of the question. It is a utopia. But to smash the old bureaucratic machine at once, and to begin immediately to construct a new one that will make it possible to gradually abolish all bureaucracy, this is not a utopia. This is the experience of the Commune, the direct and immediate task of the revolutionary proletariat. We are not utopians. We do not, quote, dream of dispensing all at once, with all administration, with all subordination. The anarchist dreams, based on incomprehension of the task of the proletarian dictatorship, are totally alien to Marxism, and, as a matter of fact, serve only to postpone the socialist revolution until people are different. No, we want the socialist revolution with people as they are now, with people who cannot dispense with subordination, control, and, quote, foremen and accountants. This subordination, however, must be the armed vanguard of all the exploited and working people, i.e., to the proletariat. A beginning can and must be made at once, overnight, to replace the specific bossing of state officials by the simple function of foremen and accountants, functions which are already fully within the ability of the average town dweller and can be performed for workmen's wages. We, the workers, shall organize large-scale production on the basis of what capitalism has already created, relying on our own experience as workers, establishing strict, iron discipline backed by the state power of the armed workers. We shall reduce the role of state officials to that of simply carrying out instructions as responsible, revocable, and modestly paid foremen and accountants. This is our proletarian task. This is what we can and must start with in accomplishing the proletariat revolution. Such a beginning on the basis of large-scale production will of itself lead to the gradual, quote, withering away of all bureaucracy, to the gradual creation of an order without inverted commas, an order bearing no similarity to wage slavery, an order under which the functions of control and accounting, becoming more and more simple, will be performed by each in turn, and will then become a habit, and will finally die out as special functions of the special section of the population. To organize the whole economy on the lines of the postal service, so that the technicians, foremen, and accountants, as well as all officials, shall receive salaries no higher than, quote, a workman's wage, all under the control and leadership of the armed proletariat. That is our immediate aim. This is what will bring about the abolition of parliamentarism and the preservation of representative institutions. This is what will rid the laboring classes of the bourgeoisie's prostitution of these institutions. On the abolition of the parasite state, i.e. the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, he writes, the utopians busied themselves with discovering political forms under which the socialist transformation of society was to take place. The anarchists dismissed the question of political forms altogether. The opportunists of present-day social democracy accepted the bourgeois political forms of the parliamentary democratic state as the limit which they should not overstep. They batted their foreheads, praying before this model, and denounced as anarchism every desire to break these forms. Marx deduced from the whole history of socialism and the political struggle that the state was bound to disappear, and that the transitional form of its disappearance, the transition from state to non-state, would be the proletariat organized as the ruling class. Marx, however, did not set out to discover the political forms of this future stage. He limited himself to carefully observing French history, to analyzing it, and to drawing conclusions to which the year 1851 had led, namely, that matters were moving towards the destruction of the bourgeois state machine. And when the mass revolutionary movement of the proletariat burst forth, Marx, in spite of its failure, in spite of its short life and patent weakness, began to study the forms it had discovered. The commune is the form, quote, at last discovered by the proletariat revolution, under which the economic emancipation of labor can take place. The commune is the first attempt by a proletarian revolution to smash the bourgeois state machine, and it is the political form, at last discovered, by which the smashed state machine can and must be replaced. We shall see, further on, that the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, in different circumstances and under different conditions, continue the work of the commune and confirm Marx's brilliant historical analysis.